How does a 4-year-old vanish without a trace from the middle of the Australian outback? No footprints. No clues. Just silence. If you're drawn to stories that search for truth beneath mystery, make sure to subscribe for more investigations like this one. 4-year-old Gus Lamont's disappearance has become one of South Australia's most haunting and confounding mysteries in recent memory. He wasn't lost in a city or a crowded park, but on a vast, remote sheep station miles from anywhere, surrounded by endless land and harsh terrain. The idea that a child could vanish in such an open space has left locals, law enforcement, and even seasoned investigators searching not just for a missing boy, but for answers that seem to keep slipping away. It began on a quiet Saturday afternoon near the small town of Ya. The Lamont family's property stretched over thousands of acres, an isolated landscape that bred self-reliance and privacy. For young Gus, it was home. He was known as curious, bright-eyed, and full of energy, the kind of child who loved to run barefoot through the fields and chase the sheep that grazed beyond the homestead. On September 27, 2025, around 5 p.m., Gus was seen playing outside near the sand, just within sight of his grandmother, Josie. It was a familiar sight, one that gave her no reason to worry. But what happened next would change everything. Josie turned her attention to the livestock for only a short while. When she returned, Gus was gone. No noise, no struggle, no sign of where he might have gone. Within minutes, she was calling his name, scanning the horizon, and retracing her steps around the homestead. But there was nothing. No small footprints in the dust, no trace of movement in the tall grass. As the minutes stretched into an hour, that initial confusion turned into panic. Josie began calling neighbors and nearby workers to help search the property, and soon, the small rural community mobilized. Dozens of locals joined the hunt, sweeping across the property with torches as daylight faded. By nightfall, the air was filled with the sound of engines, footsteps, and desperate calls for Gus. The search for Gus Lamont quickly became one of the largest in South Australian history. Police arrived later that evening, setting up a command post near the homestead. Over the next several days, helicopters circled above, scanning the dry, uneven terrain. Drones equipped with heat sensors swept through valleys and open plains. Ground teams combed through the station, marking off grids and checking every water tank, shed, and hollow. Volunteers came from nearby towns, bringing food, flashlights, and fuel. At its height, more than 100 personnel, officers, rescuers, and civilians joined forces. But despite the scale of the effort, the search yielded nothing. No items of clothing. No small footprints. No disturbance in the sand where Gus was last seen. It was as if the boy had vanished into thin air. Police described it as unprecedented, a situation that defied the laws of probability. Children don't just disappear, one officer said. They have to be somewhere. The lack of evidence was troubling, but what soon came to light was even more so, a 3-hour delay before the authorities were called. Investigators later confirmed that Gus was last seen at 5 p.m., but it wasn't until 8:30 that night that the police received a call for help. In missing child cases, the first few hours are critical. Every minute counts, especially in rough terrain or potential abduction scenarios. That gap, those missing hours, became a central point of scrutiny. Why was there such a delay? Josie had searched on her own before reaching out for help, believing Gus had simply wandered off. It was a human, almost maternal instinct to look, to hope, to assume he'd turn up nearby. But in hindsight, that decision cost valuable time. Police later noted that if foul play were involved, those hours could have allowed someone to cover their tracks or flee the area entirely. Then came another detail that would deepen the unease. Gus's father, Joshua Lamont, was not at the homestead that day. He lived over 100 kilometers away in Ballali North, a rural community hours from the station. While the distance itself wasn't unusual, many families in the region live and work apart. It raised eyebrows in the context of the investigation. Joshua hadn't joined the early searches, nor did he make any immediate public statements. Days went by, and still there was silence. In most missing child cases, parents are at the forefront, pleading for information, offering updates and showing visible anguish. Joshua's quiet absence stood in stark contrast. While police didn't accuse him of wrongdoing, they noted his lack of involvement. For a father whose son had just vanished, his silence felt unsettling to many following the case. Community members began to ask why. Was it grief? Shock? Or something else entirely? The deeper investigators dug, the more family tensions began to surface. Joshua's relationship with Gus's mother, Jess, had long been strained. They no longer lived together, and their separation had not been amicable. Adding to the complexity was Joshua's ongoing conflict with Josie, Gus's grandmother, who had played a large role in raising the child. Family acquaintances described the atmosphere as fractured, with arguments over parenting, property, and boundaries. For investigators, these dynamics were not just background, they were potential context for what might have led to Gus's disappearance. Criminologists later explained that in many missing child cases, family dynamics often hold the first clues. Disputes, custody conflicts, and emotional fractures can sometimes erupt in unpredictable ways. While there was no direct evidence linking Joshua to foul play, his actions, or lack thereof, were being watched closely. Experts noted that his detachment from public appeals, his distance from the property, and the delay in his response to police inquiries matched behavioral patterns sometimes seen in cases where a person is concealing information. As rumors spread and public scrutiny intensified, theories began to multiply. Some suggested custodial abduction, the possibility that Joshua or another family member had taken Gus without consent. Others speculated about neglect, that perhaps Gus had wandered too far from supervision and an accident had occurred. And still, there were whispers of darker possibilities, that something had happened within the family circle and was being hidden. Investigators approached each theory methodically. They revisited the timeline minute by minute, reconstructing the day Gus disappeared. Drones rescanned areas previously cleared. Detectives re-interviewed family members and examined communication records. But even with all the technology and manpower available, no definitive lead emerged. Then came the psychological analysis, the point when the search for Gus Lamont stopped being just a physical pursuit through the harsh terrain of the Australian outback and turned inward, into the minds of those closest to him. With every passing day, as the dust settled and the noise of helicopters faded, investigators began to realize that answers might not lie out in the wilderness anymore. They might lie within the walls of the Lamont home and within the people who lived there. Behavioral experts were brought in, tasked with studying how each family member reacted in the critical hours and days that followed Gus's disappearance. This wasn't just about emotion, it was about patterns, timing, and human instinct. How someone cries, what they say when the cameras arrive, whether they reach out for help or retreat into silence, every gesture becomes a piece of evidence. One name in particular began to surface repeatedly in the behavioral analysis reports: Joshua Lamont, Gus's father. To the public, Joshua had remained a mystery from the very beginning. In a community desperate for updates, where posters of Gus lined fences and shop windows, Joshua was almost invisible. He avoided interviews, declined to stand beside police during press briefings, and appeared, at least outwardly, detached from the emotional storm that had consumed everyone else. Experts began comparing his behavior to established psychological profiles. In similar cases, they noted patterns of withdrawal, refusing to speak publicly, avoiding eye contact, minimizing emotional display, were sometimes correlated with guilt or foreknowledge. Not proof, but patterns. When someone has information they're withholding, one profiler said, you often see a form of controlled detachment. They're present, but emotionally distant, almost as if they're managing themselves moment by moment. But not all psychologists agreed. Others urged caution, reminding investigators and the public that human behavior, especially in grief, is unpredictable and deeply personal. Silence, they said, can be a defense mechanism. People grieve differently. Some wail and rage. Others shut down completely. In moments of trauma, the brain often responds by protecting itself, numbing emotion, blocking out memory, or retreating from contact altogether. And that made Joshua's silence a paradox. Was it guilt or grief? As the weeks passed, the once frantic investigation entered a phase that felt both quiet and unbearably heavy. Search teams that had scoured the scrubland under the blistering sun began to thin out. The police command post, a cluster of tents and vehicles buzzing with activity in the first few days, was slowly dismantled. The hum of helicopters faded. The scent of diesel and dust gave way to stillness. For locals, that silence became its own kind of torment. Many had joined the initial search, combing through rocky terrain, checking sheds and dry creek beds, calling out the boy's name even when hope began to fade. Now, the same land that had once been alive with movement felt lifeless. The posters of Gus, his bright eyes frozen in time, remained taped to the windows of shops and pinned to fences that lined the dirt roads. "We just want him home," one neighbor said softly to a reporter. "Even if it's not the ending we hope for." The story of Gus had by now spread far beyond the small town. It had become a national conversation, a mystery that captured Australia's collective conscience. Television crews returned regularly, hoping for updates. Online forums buzzed with speculation. And yet, despite the noise outside, inside the official investigation, things were moving quietly but deliberately. Police refused to name any official suspects, but their statements were careful, precise, and deliberate. "All possibilities remain on the table," one spokesperson said during a brief update. It was a phrase that both reassured and unsettled the public. What did all possibilities really mean? Did it include abduction?
Accident?
Or something darker, something closer to home? Behind closed doors, detectives continued their methodical probe. They cross-checked statements, reconstructed timelines, and looked for inconsistencies in the family's accounts. They focused on time gaps in communication, moments where calls weren't made or messages weren't answered. They also began to study the family's history, which appeared, at least from fragments, to be more complicated than it first seemed. In every missing child investigation, the first step is to eliminate the impossible. But here, nothing could be ruled out with certainty. The land offered no clues. No footprints that led away.
No discarded clothing.
No trace of struggle. The desert, vast and indifferent, had swallowed everything, including answers. Then a new voice entered the discussion. Dr. Xanthi Mallet, one of Australia's most recognized criminologists and experts in forensic behavior. Her analysis of the case, presented in several media appearances, added a layer of both authority and intrigue. Dr. Mallet emphasized that while the lack of physical evidence made it difficult to prove abduction or foul play, the behavioral dynamics within the Lamont family could not be overlooked. "In cases like this," she said, "it's not just about where the child went. It's about how the people closest to them respond when they're gone. Behavior doesn't lie. It tells us what people are capable of, what they fear, and sometimes what they're hiding." Her words reignited public debate. For every viewer convinced Joshua's silence was suspicious, there was another who saw it as human, even relatable. "If my child vanished," one parent wrote online, "I wouldn't be able to speak either. I'd be in shock." Others disagreed, arguing that any loving parent would be screaming for help, pleading for information, begging for their child's safe return. And that's what made Joshua's case so complicated. He didn't scream. He didn't plead. He simply withdrew. As days turned into weeks, that withdrawal only deepened. Joshua made no major public statements. He stopped appearing in community searches. Even when journalists approached him outside his property, he declined to comment. Some saw this as defiance. Others saw it as despair. His absence became louder than words ever could. In many ways, it reflected the central tension of the entire case, the difference between what people show and what they actually feel. Detectives, journalists, and psychologists alike found themselves studying every pause, every unanswered question, every photograph where Joshua looked away from the camera. Was he shielding himself or hiding something? Meanwhile, for Gus's mother, the ordeal seemed to manifest differently. She was often seen with police, cooperating closely, occasionally breaking down during interviews. Her grief appeared raw, visible, and public. The contrast between her emotional openness and Joshua's detachment only deepened the mystery, creating two opposing portraits of loss, one expressive, one silent. As more time passed, hope began to slip quietly away. What had once been a rescue mission was now something far more grim, a search for understanding. How could a child vanish on familiar land, in open daylight, with no witnesses and no trace? Why was there such a delay in calling for help? And most haunting of all, what explains a father's silence when his son is gone? Investigators tried to answer those questions, but every path seemed to lead back to the same uneasy conclusion. This was not just a mystery about a missing child. It was a study of human behavior under pressure. The investigation became as much psychological as it was procedural. Detectives weren't just tracking movements. They were decoding emotion, contradiction, and silence. One investigator later described the case as a mirror. Every person involved, every witness, every relative seemed to reflect something different. Some reflected grief, others defensiveness, and some reflected nothing at all. Yet, through all of this, one fact remained unshakable. Gus Lamont was still missing. The land where he was last seen stretched endlessly, miles of dust, rock, and dry scrub, bordered by fences that seemed to hold nothing in and nothing out. It was a place where sound carried far, but answers never did. As the days turned to months, the vast outback grew quiet again, almost as if it, too, had grown tired of waiting. But for investigators, silence was never an ending. It was a clue. They began revisiting interviews, rechecking statements that hadn't quite aligned. Some officers believed that within the pauses and hesitations, the key to the truth might still be hidden. Even the smallest inconsistencies began to take on new meaning. A timeline that didn't match exactly. A memory that seemed rehearsed. A reaction that felt slightly off. Piece by piece, they began assembling a psychological map of the family's behavior, trying to locate not where Gus went, but where the truth had been buried. The mystery of the Lamont case, however, extended beyond forensics and analysis. It tapped into something universal, the fear that what looks ordinary can suddenly, inexplicably, collapse into tragedy. A home, a family, a child's laughter, all can vanish in a moment, leaving behind only silence and suspicion. For Australia, the story of Gus Lamont became a haunting reminder of that fragility. Communities held vigils. Schools collected donations for continued searches. But even in collective mourning, unease lingered. No one knew whether to hope or to brace for heartbreak. As of today, Gus remains missing. The search area has long since been cleared of police vehicles and search teams. The scent dogs, the drones, the grids of marked-off land, all gone. What remains is the echo of questions that refuse to fade. Somewhere, within the layers of family tension, delayed responses, and unspoken emotion, lies the truth of what happened that day. Whether it was a tragic accident, an abduction, or something unthinkable, no one yet knows. But one thing is certain. The case of Gus Lamont has grown far larger than one missing child. It has become a story about the limits of understanding, about how people act when they're broken, and how silence can sometimes tell us more than words ever could. Until that truth is uncovered, the disappearance of Gus Lamont will remain one of Australia's most haunting mysteries, a case that sits uneasily at the intersection of tragedy and human psychology. Because sometimes, in the aftermath of loss, what people don't say can speak louder than anything they ever could. And until the day that silence is broken, the world will keep asking the same quiet question. What really happened to Gus Lamont? If you want to stay updated as new details emerge in cases like this, remember to subscribe for the next investigation.